Welcome back, my fellow assassins, to a very special episode of the Dark Assassins Podcast, the show that dives deep into not just technology, but the concepts, software, and procedures behind it all, and explains it so simply that even your grandma can understand it. As always, I'm your host, the Dark Assassin. So if you recall earlier in the year when I kind of did my goals for the year, one of the goals that I had was to maybe potentially have some guests on the podcast, so it's not always just me. Well, I guess you can consider that goal met, because this week I got the chance to sit down with a good friend of mine, dosdude1. Some of you may have heard of him. If you listen to the podcast, I've brought him up on a couple of occasions. But this week I got to sit down with him and have a conversation about some of the projects he's worked on, some of his patchers, future projects he has planned, and I hope you enjoy this conversation with dosdude1. So sitting next to me is a good friend of mine and absolute legend in the Apple sphere, dosdude1. dosdude1, good to have you on the podcast.
Thanks for having me on.
So I guess as far as where to start, I mean, you have one of the most interesting resumes, I think, out there. I mean, you've done everything from Mac software to Mac, you've done patchers, you've done mods. I mean, where do you think is the best place to start?
Probably with, let's just start with the hardware side of things, because that's what I did first.
All right, yeah, I think that's kind of where I wanted to go with this, was like, where did you get started, like, in the mods and the Apple sphere? So I guess that's probably a good place to start.
Well, my first ever thing that I did with any Mac was I replaced some capacitors on an iMac G5 motherboard, which I got from Goodwill for $30 many, many years ago. And for those of you who don't know, that's a common issue with those. And that was literally the first thing that I ever soldered or replaced any soldered components on ever. So
is that like your first introduction to Apple and Apple products too, or were you in there before in the game before that?
I had two other machines before that, a PowerBook G4 Titanium and an iBook G3, but that was it.
Nice. Yeah, I mean, for those of you who haven't seen dosdude1's channel, I mean, he does some pretty insane hardware mods that I think the average person would never even dream of doing. And they would see some of these machines that he takes apart, and man, I've seen some of the videos, and I'm like, wow, there's no way I could do that. I mean, I think I've soldered like one thing in my life. And I think that was back at like a summer camp. I was doing like a merit badge or something for like some electronics thing, and that was about it. Another thing that you did that I thought was interesting that some of the people listening might know is that that GPU that you added extra VRAM to.
Oh yeah, so that was one of Will's things. This was for an Apple Xserve that he had gotten, and we were trying to find, a GT640 GPU, just a small GPU we could put in this Xserve that would fit in it, that would have a boot screen, be flashable for Mac, and, work in macOS. And he got one card initially, and it was bad. Even before flashing it, it didn't work at all. So we ended up getting another one, and the issue with that second one was that the amount of VRAM on the card, 1 gigabyte, wasn't compatible with any Mac ROMs available. They were only for 2 gigabyte cards. So I figure, rather than trying to either modify the video ROM or trying to find another card that already has 2 gigs, we should just try to upgrade it to 2 gigs and then use the ROM for a 2 gig card. And sure enough, that was simple as replacing all 8 VRAM chips, flashing that Mac ROM on there, and it worked perfectly with 2 gigs of VRAM.
Yeah, so if you want to check out that video, he's got it on his YouTube channel. If you search dosdude1 on YouTube, that was a pretty cool video, because I remember when you recorded that video and I watched it, you were like, a friend of mine, has this card, and I was like, oh, I know that guy.
Yes.
Yes. So let's see some of the other crazy mods you did. Recently, as the day we're recording this, a certain YouTuber by the name Luke Miani had a video go out today where he took a look at a 17-inch MacBook Pro with a PCI Express expandable module on it that you can plug in through the optical drive port. and I bet you can't guess who was the creator of such MacBook. So do you want to tell us a little bit about that crazy project that you worked on?
So that project was based on a piece of hardware designed by someone in Malaysia. He actually runs like a repair shop there. His company's name is iBoff, and he, as well as a few other people that he works with, designed this whole custom setup. Like, it consists of like 4 or 5 custom PCBs that basically allow you to take PCI Express lanes off of your MacBook motherboard that were initially used for hardware on the board, like a Thunderbolt controller or a dedicated video chipset, and use that for basically whatever you want. So in the case of this, there's 2 breakout boards that take the Thunderbolt and dedicated video card footprints and convert them to PCI Express lanes that then connect to another board, which goes in the optical drive slot that allows you to install both an NVMe SSD as well as provides a by 8 PCI Express port on the side of the machine inside the optical drive slot.
I mean, just kind of like, if you haven't seen the video, he has another video on this on his YouTube channel. It's just kind of like the cabling, that blue cabling that kind of almost looks like spaghetti in a way, just kind of like running through the underside of the board. And the way that, do you have, I know you mentioned talking about like an external case for it. Have you gotten one of those cases for it, or is it just all?
No, but he designed it to go in, like, one of those eGPU enclosures
Yeah.
that you can get. It either can go in one of those, or it's also designed to fit in like a micro ATX, or not a micro ATX, but an ITX PC case. So you could just use an ITX PC case, put the video card as well as his boards in there, and then literally just plug your MacBook into like a PC case, and then that would be your eGPU setup.
And I think for the people out there, the main benefit of this is you don't have to deal with any of the performance hits by doing the regular route with eGPU through Thunderbolt, right?
Yeah, because for one, Thunderbolt, it has 4 lanes to it, which is already half the lanes of the dedicated video uh, connector, or the dedicated video chipset. But you also lose some bandwidth going into the Thunderbolt protocol. So it's definitely way better to use like a dedicated PCI Express bus like this. It also allows you to add different hardware that otherwise you couldn't over Thunderbolt also.
Yeah, so I mean, you could pretty much do anything you wanted. You could do GPUs, you could do network cards, you
Yep.
could
Yep.
do SSDs. I mean, pretty much sky's the limit. Anything you can. Well, I guess your only limitation really is potential macOS support, right? At that point.
Yeah, or you could always run other operating systems as well.
That's
So,
true. I mean, especially when you're talking 2012 or I guess 2011 17-inch MacBook Pro, it's not exactly supported under the latest version of macOS now.
no.
But speaking of 2012 MacBooks, what about how did you come up with that idea to take a 2012 15-inch MacBook Pro and try to convert it into a 17-inch MacBook Pro and make this like hybrid beast of a 2012 17-inch MacBook Pro?
Yeah. So that came about from an idea I had because the pinout, or the BGA footprint and pinout of the Ivy Bridge and Sandy Bridge chipsets are the same basically. So you can use like Ivy Bridge QM series CPU on a board that originally had a Sandy Bridge QM series CPU. Now the only snag there is you can't just swap the CPU on that specific board because Apple decided to use the HM65 PCH, which does not support Ivy Bridge QM series CPUs. So, in order to make that work, because I could only use a QM series CPU, I had to also swap the chipset, or the PCH, from a Ivy Bridge system, from a 6 series, the HM65, to a 7 series, an HM77, which is what the 2012 15-inch board uses, and as well as a 13-inch board, they're all the same. But the only issue there, and the same as the issue with the CPU, if I didn't have to change the PCH, I'd still have the same issue, is the system firmware doesn't support Ivy Bridge hardware. So originally I thought I could maybe just take the ROM, or the firmware from the 2012 board and just flash it on 11 board and it would work. Well, unfortunately, that didn't work because there's a lot of differences in the way they use the GPIO of the PCH. So I had to literally make a custom port of Coreboot, which is like an open source UEFI / BIOS implementation. So I had to make a custom build of that specifically for this weird, like Ivy Bridge upgraded 2011 MacBook Pro motherboard. And that took a long time and a lot of research to actually successfully do. But now that I have pretty much finished it, everything works like you would expect on a real Mac with stock firmware.
So theoretically, since you have this like firmware made and everything, you could at this point you could essentially at will create as many 17-inch MacBooks that are essentially 2012s, which never existed by Apple if you
Yep,
wanted to.
exactly. And I plan on doing that exact upgrade to that one that I have the PCI Express mod done to as well. So it'll be not only PCI Express modded, but it'll have now Ivy Bridge hardware, which supports PCI Express 3.0 instead of just PCI Express 2.0 on Sandy Bridge, which means I can get double the bandwidth out of both the X8 PCI Express slot as well as the 4-lane PCI Express slot used for the NVMe SSD.
So basically, the most powerful MacBook, 2012, 17-inch MacBook that has ever existed, that Apple never sold, you can make.
Yes.
That's pretty cool. So I guess also going off of some Mac mods, like the funny thing about this is I remember back when we were in college, we created a MacBook for me that was essentially that we called the Frankenbook because we took like basically every part of the MacBook was from a different Mac.
Yeah.
And then here you are now, literally taking pieces, like not even just, oh, you took a motherboard from this Mac, a screen from that one, a battery from this one. You're like, oh, I'm going to take a chip from this board, put it onto this board, plug it, and just completely Frankenstein the thing.
Yes.
Which I think is pretty darn cool. So I guess other Mac mods you did, you also worked on an SSD mod too for like the old MacBook Airs, didn't you?
No, so that was just a custom SSD that I designed.
Okay.
And basically, the original reason I designed it was because the first-gen MacBook Air is extremely picky about what drives it supports, and it doesn't work with any sort of compact flash adapter, SD card adapter, or IDE to SATA adapter for like an mSATA SSD or something like that. So I'm like, well, I could either get this one drive from China that's way overpriced and pretty crappy quality-wise, or I could just reverse engineer this controller that it uses and that a lot of compact flash cards use, and use that to create my own SSD design that does work in that machine as well as any other machine that uses ZIF IDE. So that's exactly what I did. And then later I adapted the same design in a 2.5-inch IDE form factor, so it would be useful in various like vintage laptops and stuff like that that use 2.5-inch IDE drives.
And then I'm pretty sure you also have like all that code open source on your GitHub too, don't you?
Yep. The whole the KiCad project with all the schematics and board design and everything is open source. So if you want to make one yourself or modify the design to suit either a specific machine or create drives in different IDE form factors like 3.5-inch, you can definitely do that.
So also, if you want to check out any of the coding projects he's done, you can also check out his GitHub too, over at dosdude1 on GitHub. So I guess that could be a decent segue into some of the software stuff you wrote. So I guess probably one of the most well-known piece of software you're known for are your macOS patchers.
Yep.
So why don't you walk us through? So I guess the first question has to be is how did you come up with the idea of one, making the patchers, and two, how did you go about getting them to work so older Macs can run newer versions of macOS?
Yeah, so I got into the patches, like I've always been into patching later versions of macOS on machines that don't support it. But when Sierra came around, And even with El Capitan and Yosemite kind of had a patcher that never really fully worked. But basically there was nobody actually making like nice, easy to use, like GUI based patching tools. So I was like, well, I like doing Mac development. I like using Objective-C and writing Cocoa applications. So I figure I just like use that and like gain experience with Cocoa and Objective-C by creating like automated patching tools to make installing like later macOS versions like extremely easy and user friendly. So that's when I made Sierra Patcher, which is my first ever iteration of automated patchers, which nowadays probably isn't the best thing, but back then patching macOS was super simple. It was like just a few small files you had to modify, maybe a few kexts you had to copy over from older versions of macOS that did support the hardware that you were trying to support, and it was very, very simple. So I basically was able to do that all on my own, like all the patching, everything, and figuring out how to like patch the installer to bypass all the system checks and modify it and stuff like that. And then I, of course, made a tool that, would create a modified installer. You could run it, run some post-install patches, and then you'd have a later version of macOS running on a machine it didn't support. So that was pretty much how I got started, basically because no one else was doing it and because I wanted to gain experience with Cocoa and Objective-C.
Because I know I've used some of the patchers before. The Catalina patcher was probably I think probably the best one, and I mean going out on top for sure. That one was super simple. I mean, you didn't even really have to do any post install patches since you got to the point where it was able to not only detect like what system you were using, but also automatically install those drivers itself. So how did you figure out? Did you have to like go into so I guess walk us through the process of how you figured out all the various kexts and drivers and all the other additional support you had to put on these Macs that weren't supported by Apple when making the patchers.
Yeah. So it was all pretty smooth sailing with High Sierra, Sierra, High Sierra, and High Sierra. But when Mojave came around, that added some much increased complexity, and the fact that Apple killed support for all non-metal video cards. Now, while the rest of the patching was pretty simple, like USB patching, audio patching, Wi-Fi card patching, it's basically just small kex modifications. The video card issue was a whole nother tier of complexity in of itself. And that was a team effort between myself and like 2 or 3 other people at the time that were very good reverse engineering people. And at that time, I wasn't like super well versed at reverse engineering, but since then, since the Mojave Patcher days, I've gotten a lot better at it using disassemblers, analyzing assembly, patching binaries, and stuff like that. But that was basically what was required for this to work. We had to make like some wrapper frameworks. Actually, this was more of an issue with Catalina, but I think the same was the case with Mojave, at least to a lesser extent. So we had to figure out how to patch like system frameworks and add basically shim functions to restore functionality that was stripped out of these frameworks when Apple killed support for non-metal video cards. And support for non-metal video cards has always been pretty much a hack, but with Mojave and Catalina, it actually worked pretty well.
And I know that's an issue that OpenCore, the kind of now the more mainstream patcher, they're running into like similar issues with video cards too, aren't they?
And it's basically the same issues, just even more complex. With Big Sur, things got way more complex. They completely redid how the installer works. Like they redid that implementation from the ground up, more basing it on how iOS updates are installed and how iOS firmware is installed. So basically, because of that, it made it nearly impossible to patch the installer properly to have it work without OpenCore. And the reason OpenCore is so nice and makes it so easy is because you can simply spoof like the machine model and like basically spoof that it's a virtual machine, which Apple has like special checks for that bypass all the compatibility stuff. So you can literally just tell macOS that the machine is a VM and it'll just skip all those checks and you don't have to patch anything. And then the other issue is with some older CPUs that don't support later instructions like SSE 4.2, you have to patch the kernel to not utilize or not try to call those functions. You have to basically hook any function that would call opcodes that were only in an SSE 4.2 CPU. Otherwise, of course, you get a kernel panic with a invalid instruction. So patching the kernel is pretty much impossible to do. I mean, there are ways to do it, but it's very unreliable and would probably not be useful or work very effectively in like a consumer grade patcher. So OpenCore also allows you to dynamically patch kernel functions as well. So you can patch whatever piece of code in the kernel that you desire and it will dynamically patch every system boot, so you don't have to worry about a patched kernel getting overwritten and causing kernel panics that you can't recover from, and stuff like that. So that's kind of why I stopped with the patchers and just delegated that task onto OpenCore Legacy Patcher team, just because it would be so much more robust that way. And they've done a great job with it, so.
Yeah, and I know another issue that OpenCore has been having is with I guess the surge of Apple M1 chips and their own silicon, and how quickly they're killing off Intel Macs. Uh, Trying to get that support back in because how much stuff they're just stripping out for macOS kind of makes it hard to get all that stuff back in.
Yeah, mainly, like I said, the main stuff we have to deal with is CPU support and video card support. It's the most complicated parts of it at this point. Um, but with the regards to the transition to Apple Silicon, that's not really causing any issues directly, and that's just because obviously Apple still supports Intel-based systems because they still sell them. So until macOS completely kills support for Intel, like they did with PowerPC back in 2009 with the last Leopard release, we won't have to worry about anything in that regard.
So that's actually one question I wanted to get your input on. So once inevitably when Apple fully kills off Intel, what do you think that means for the patching industry? Do you think they're going to find some workaround hack to still have Intel support, or do you think it's just going to switch to only supporting Apple Silicon chips that eventually get dropped?
Yeah, so once Apple stops compiling macOS for Intel, that's it, because you can't derive Intel code from ARM code or what have you. So if Apple decides they don't want to support Intel anymore and never release any Intel release, then there's nothing that can be done at that point. Now, with regard to patching Apple Silicon Macs, like say Apple drops an Apple or a Mac that has Apple Silicon many years from now with a newer version of macOS, that's very much unknown at this point. We don't know how Apple enforces like signing, if there's any like extra checks in there. But if I had to say, there's probably a 50-50 shot that it is still possible.
I think especially with all the work that's been done, like on Asahi Linux, trying to get Linux support for the Apple Silicon Macs, and just trying to basically reverse engineering how these chips are designed. I think in a weird twist, the Linux community would help the Mac OS patcher community kind of better understand the chip architecture, and that might help potential future patchers on Apple Silicon Macs maybe.
Yeah, I think the main saving grace here is that signing, like operating system signing, like on iOS devices, is optional on Apple Silicon Macs. Now, while such a thing is enabled by default, it is possible to disable that and install any version of macOS you desire. So I think from that alone, there's a good chance that the OS will be patchable, at least in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah, I mean, as far as like Intel support, once everything's going over to Apple Silicon, the only thing that I could have thought to even have Intel have a shred of hope would be some kind of like kernel level, or essentially create like some kind of hypervisor or something to basically emulate and kind of do like Rosetta but in reverse, where you like on the fly try to translate the ARM instructions over to x86. But I mean, performance wise, I mean that would just be awful, especially on like older hardware for sure.
Yeah, I don't think it would be that bad performance-wise. It's just implementing something like that is a massive undertaking that I don't think anyone's gonna do. It's not like it's been done for PowerPC Macs. Of course, that was a long time ago at this point, but it doesn't seem like it's something that is likely to happen.
Yeah. And then let's see, as far as other software based stuff you've been so I know another interesting project that you were working on, trying to switching gears here a little bit, was were creating your own Discord client for and the range of support on that thing was quite impressive. You want to tell us about that?
Yeah, so that was basically an experiment that I wanted to do, basically to learn about quote unquote old school like Cocoa and Objective C development. And I wanted to see if I could take some idea, so a Discord client, and see how, like, what would be the largest range of machines that I could get it to work on. And using non-arc or automatic reference counting Objective C, I was able to get it to compile as a tri-fat binary, which means it has PowerPC, 32-bit Intel, and 64-bit Intel native code in it, and also supported macOS versions as old as 10.4 up to the latest version of Ventura, all with one executable.
I mean that's pretty impressive. I mean that's even I mean not to I mean and theoretically you could even run that on Apple Silicon too
Yeah, you could through
through
Rosetta,
Rosetta, yeah.
and I was able to successfully compile it for Apple Silicon or ARM, but it was kind of a pain to do, and I had to like use two different machines and then splice the binaries together after the fact. And but with my main compilation setup, I can compile for PowerPC, 32-bit Intel, and 64-bit Intel, all with the same version of Xcode, same SDK on the same machine, and then just have it work that way.
Yeah, that is pretty nice. So I guess going back to some hardware mod stuff you did, so one of the most infamous issues that Macs have had is the 2011 MacBooks with their dedicated graphics cards and how fantastic those things are and how reliable they are and how they never ever die on you. Uh, so you came up with a couple different ways to fix that issue. Do you want to tell us about some of those and how you came up with them?
So there's a few different iterations with regard to the hardware side of things on that, but the initial thing that had been done previously to any sort of hardware bypasses was using a specific NVRAM variable that luckily Apple was nice enough to implement that would force the GMUX IC in the machine to default to using the integrated video chipset instead of the dedicated video card. And that was a okay solution, other than the fact that if you reset NVRAM, or if you loaded a copy of macOS, which then in turn loaded the AMD video drivers, those changes would get reverted. So the next time you rebooted, it would go back to the dedicated video card, and then you'd have to apply that NVRAM patch all over again to go back, and then it's just a huge pain, and it's not a very good solution at all because of that. Now, what my idea was, why not just bypass the GMUX IC entirely, which is a piece of hardware on the board that handles switching the display output to either use the AMD GPU or the Intel HD graphics on the motherboard. So my first idea was, well, we'll just take wires, like a bunch of baud wires, and just route around the chip. And that worked pretty well, actually, but it had a few issues. A, it was hard as heck to apply that mod. It took a really long time. And B, it had issues with some screens due to lack of LVDS buffering, which was handled by the GMUX IC. And it would cause like lines or artifacting on the screen, not due to the video card, but due to noise in the LVDS interface. My second iteration of that was to take the wires and just create a PCB that you could literally just solder on the board, and it would do all that routing for you so you didn't have to manually solder wires. And that worked just as well as the wires did, but it was a lot easier to install. Now, the third iteration was a completely new thing that I decided to try, and that is literally just writing custom FPGA code, or hardware description language, or Verilog, whatever you want to call it, for the Gmux IC, which is an FPGA, to make it do what I wanted it to do. And doing this, I was able to A, add the necessary LVDS buffering, B, make the installation super easy. You literally just have to flash the chip with a programmer. And 3, I was able to re-add backlight brightness control to the chip, which was a function that you couldn't get when bypassing it. So, with all that done, that is basically the ultimate solution to fully fixing the 2011 15-inch and 17-inch machines that had a dead AMD video card.
Or I guess the other solution is you could just, if you had a 17-inch one, you could just desolder the GPU and then use that kit that you mentioned earlier and throw a dedicated GPU in there, upgrade the CPU, chump change, easy to
Yeah,
do.
but even in that case, you still have to program the Gmux not to use the dedicated video chipset, because if you do, or if you don't do that, the Gmux IC has no idea the chip's gone and it's going to try to use it, and it's not going to show anything on the screen because, well, it's trying to use the AMD GPU. So even with that mod done, you still have to apply Dmux, or custom firmware.
Gotcha. Yeah, I guess that would make sense as far as the chip's concerned, it doesn't know that, other things on the board are being removed. So then when you try to, it's like, just in like programming too, if you try to access something that doesn't exist, program's not happy, or in this case, computer's not happy, and you run into crashing problems.
Yeah.
So as far as all these mods that you do, where do you come up with the idea for some of these mods? Because I know like some of the stuff you do, you'll take like, super old computers. Like I know one time you took I think it was like an iMac G4 or something, and like upgraded the CPU in that, and upgraded the CPU, like soldered CPUs and Mac Minis. And
Yep.
Where do you come up with the ideas for this stuff?
Well, I just kind of think about something that I think might be possible and that sounds fun. So, like, and then I just say, I do a little bit of research, I'll look at some data sheets, some pinouts, some schematics if I can manage to find it, and then I'm like, well, that looks like it probably would work, so I guess I'll have to try it now and test it. And most of the time, my hunch and everything is correct, and I end up with a successful modification. So, same goes for like RAM upgrades, like CPU upgrades. Like I check to see, is this CPU compatible with this footprint? Does it have the same pinout? Can I patch the firmware appropriately so that the machine will boot with this CPU? Because that's a thing you have to worry about sometimes. And eventually, even though it might be pretty difficult, like in the case of that Ivy Bridge upgrade, I do manage to figure something out in the end.
Yeah, it's just so impressive. Like every time, like I'll see you like drop a new video, and it's just like something completely off the wall that I'm like, how the heck did he? One, how did you figure out how to do this? And two, where did you even come up with the idea of how to do this? Since some of them, I guess you could kind of like you can see the link between the 2011 and 2012 MacBooks. With how similar Ivy Bridge and Sandy Bridge is. But then some of the other stuff, it's just like, what? Let's see, what else? So as far as like some of the other mods you did, I know how did you figure, one of the things that I thought was super cool that you did was when you made that custom boot chime where you could change the boot chime on Macs. How did you figure that out?
So I got kind of lucky on that one in the fact that in a later firmware version, Apple changed the way the startup chime is like encoded in the ROM, kind of. So in the old school Intel ROMs, the Apple startup chime is encoded as a CAF file, but it's not a normal CAF file. It's like a part of a CAF file and like other parts of a CAF file that explain certain things about like the content of the audio in it. stripped slightly and then moved to a different part of the file. So it's like, I don't know why they did it this way, but but with a later firmware version, they redid the startup chime implementation, but they left the same startup chime in there. So I was able to take that and compare the startup chimes from the old school boot ROM and the new boot ROM and figure out like what they did to modify, because the files are the same, right? It's the same exact sound.
Right.
And all the data in there is the same, but like it's in a slightly different spot and like some of it's stripped. So I was able to analyze that, figure out exactly what they did to derive that weird CAF file format from a normal CAF file. And I wrote a tool, just a little C program that takes a normal CAF file, converts it to this weird format, and then you can literally just inject it into the ROM using UEFI tool, then flash it back on and it will work.
So I'm pretty sure you mentioned in the videos all the different Macs it works on, but what Macs are compatible with this mod in particular?
Any Intel Mac that's not T2 based. So, because you can't modify the system firmware of T2 Macs, unfortunately, there was a way to do it at one point with the checkrain exploit, but that's since been patched. Not checkrain, but the other part to it where you change the boot chime. That part's been patched, and so far no one has figured out how to do that at this point. And I really don't intend to try to figure that out because the T2 chip is complete and utter trash, and I really don't want to mess with those machines.
Yeah, I mean, another thing about the T2 chips is that the butterfly keyboard, which I know you're a huge fan of the butterfly keyboard. Uh, so out of all the mods that you've done, do you have one that sticks out as like your favorite one that you've done?
I gotta say, the one that's my favorite is the most ridiculous one, and that is that PCI Express mod, because I've never seen anything like that on anything, because like just having like there's no laptop that exists that has a PCI Express slot accessible like that.
That's true.
I mean, there's laptops with MXM video cards, but that's not really the same thing.
Right.
So just like having a laptop and at that a MacBook with an external, like fully usable PCI Express slot is just like the coolest thing.
Yeah. I mean, so I know so the guy that sells it, do you know how many people have done this mod? I mean, there's obviously has to be some kind of like demand for it for someone to make the thing, but I mean, I've never seen any other, in existence aside from yours.
Yeah. No, I don't know for sure, but I do know that. So he makes two versions of the mod. There's one that has the X8 PCI Express slot on the side of the machine, and then there's one that only has NVMe. So, it only connects to where the Thunderbolt controller used to connect, and it's compatible with 13-inch machines as well. And I have had one person who paid me to install that mod on one of their MacBooks. But other than that, I really have no idea how many people actually, have used something like this. But in order to do something or perform a modification like that yourself, it's a very tough thing to do. So you'd have to have a lot of soldering experience or pay someone that did, like myself, to do it. So if I had to guess, there's probably not more than 10 people that have that done.
Yeah, I mean, like you mentioned, the soldering experience and kind of like the knowledge alone to be able to do a mod like that is probably
Yeah.
more than the average consumer would have. Plus, I guess the other thing too is most people, they don't necessarily appreciate, the old Mac hardware, and it doesn't run the latest, Mac OS version, and it's old. They want something faster and newer. But I think, the novelty of it for some people is kind of what drives us to it, which I think is probably a, good something that would describe you pretty well is kind of the novelty of, working on these older machines.
Yeah. Yeah. It's definitely fun. Just because they're, I mean, relatively easy to work on compared to the 2016 and later models, which are just a horrible design failure haven, but we won't get into that now, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, The one thing I will give them credit for on the 2016 models is how slim and thin they are.
They look
they
nice.
look
Yeah.
nice. But then if you try to do anything performance intensive, then you have a nice place to cook your eggs in the morning on.
Yeah, I mean, that's not that different from older models, but the thing is, like, the physical, like, case and the way the screen connects and just, like, physical things about the machine, of course, the butterfly keyboard, are just bad, like, badly designed and badly implemented. And it didn't help when they put the T2 chip in there in 2018, which is even worse. It just took an already horrible machine and just made it even worse because the T2 chip in and of itself is a horrible design.
Yeah, I mean, and I think for more other people that aren't necessarily trying to like, solder things to boards and all that kind of stuff, just the fact that really, I guess you could even argue with the Retina MacBook Pros, the lack of upgradability that they started implementing where you can't. I mean, in the Retina MacBook Pros, you could at least still like upgrade the SSD. I mean, you might have to get maybe some adapter, and you could put. I mean, you could get an adapter off Amazon, I think, for like less than $10 or something like that, and you
Yeah.
can throw whatever NVMe SSD you want in there. But then once they switch to the newer design, and even now with the M series Macs with Apple Silicon, like there's just zero upgradability.
Yep.
Um, and then I think, and the thing that's even worse about, I think, the newer Macs to some extent is the fact that because your storage is soldered to the board, if anything on your board goes down, all your data's gone too.
Yep. Yeah, that's another thing about it. But on the M1 or on the Apple Silicon machines, upgrading the onboard NANDs to actually upgrade your storage is actually way easier than doing the same on the Intel machines. Because you don't have to configure anything. You just plop the NANDs onto a DFU restore and you're good. It's literally that simple. The Intel ones, you have to actually program the NANDs and they all have to, like, have a specific piece of data to be on a specific set of pads on the board. It's just a massive pain on Intel systems, and more so even on the T2 systems. But for some reason, and I guess it's just the way the chipsets are with ARM, it's a lot easier. So that's another experiment I'll be doing sometime in the future.
Yeah, you took what I was about to say. I was like, are you hinting that we're gonna see a video coming out in sometime in the near future of you upgrading the storage on an Apple Silicon machine?
Definitely an idea.
I mean, that would be cool since I know. I mean, if you try to, upgrade storage from Apple themselves, I mean, it's basically a ripoff.
Yeah.
I mean, $200 for 256 gigs is kind of absurd.
Yeah.
Um, so I know one problem that some people have had, like, so you talk about mention upgrading the NAND chips. So do you know why you can upgrade the NAND chips like that on the Apple Silicon machines, but in the cases like the Mac Studio that had like dedicated what kind of looked like M.2 slots that you could put new modules in, why trying to upgrade the storage in that didn't work?
Yeah, that I haven't really looked into, but I think it should be in theory the same because all they are NANDs on a board. So that'll have to be something I experiment with someday, but I don't know whenever I'll get my hands on a Mac Studio.
Yeah, I mean, because the thing that I heard was potentially the reason was something with the storage controller that's like built in directly to the chip itself, and something with that could maybe be the problem. But I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not sure on that one.
Yeah. So as far as future hardware and mod stuff, do you have anything interesting coming down the pipeline aside from, these potential mods to Apple Silicon machines that you talked about?
There's one other thing, and this is obviously a novelty thing, but on the first generation Apple TV, I think it might be possible to bodge on 4 extra RAM chips in order to get 1 GB of RAM out of it from its original 256 MB. So that's something I want to try. And another thing I might try is upgrading the dedicated video chipset on a 2011 MacBook Pro to like one from a 2015 model because the pinout and footprint is the same between the R9 M370X and the HD graphics or the Intel or the AMD HD 6000 series video chipsets.
No, that's impressive.
Yeah.
So
There's other differences that I'm 50-50 on that may or may not throw a wrench in that plan, but I'll try it at some point and see. It's definitely worth a shot.
So, compatibility-wise, how would that even work? Because, like, you have a CPU from one It's not like when we talked about the 17-inch model that you upgraded, you went from 2011 to everything being from 2012. But in this case, you have like a CPU from 2012 or 2011, and then a GPU from 2015. So as far as like Mac OS and compatibility is concerned, how would that work?
I mean, that should still work. I mean, it's a metal compatible video card, so is HD Graphics 4000, so it should just work, as long as that upgrade works.
Right.
Which, like I said, I'm not sure about. There are a few differences that I think are going to make it not work. But I've got to at least try it, you know?
Oh, yeah, I mean, of course. I mean, if you can create like a 20, I mean, even if you put in a 17-inch or just kind of any, unibody MacBook running, the AMD graphics from the 2015s, which is, some people would regard like, the best MacBook ever.
Yeah,
I mean, that would just be,
I know.
that would be impressive.
Yeah.
Um,
Because if you could have, like, a working dedicated video chipset that's, like, way better than the AMD HD 6000 series and is way more reliable and, like, never fails,
True.
then you could, like, actually fully repair that system, like, finally, after a long time. But you wouldn't want to do that with the original Sandy Birch hardware because you'd have a non-metal HD Graphics 3000 paired with a metal video card, and that would cause all sorts of issues with later macOS versions.
Yeah. And I mean, especially now that, the 2015s aren't even supported by Apple natively anymore, people might be starting to get rid of them potentially.
Yeah.
So you might maybe see, I mean, I know the prices are already, coming down, although I think that probably also has to do with Apple Silicon and everything.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, I don't even need to get one because I already have a couple boards, just dead donor boards that I can pull chips from, so.
Yeah, speaking of getting stuff, I mean, I like to talk about how sometimes I'll find great scores on eBay, but when it comes to finding scores on eBay, I mean, you make me look like I'm getting completely ripped off and paying like scalper prices. So how do you come across, like, sometimes you'll mention to me like you got, like, just before we recorded this podcast, you were talking about a pallet of like, APs or access points that you could, for Wi-Fi and stuff for like $5 a pop, which I guess that wasn't specifically on eBay, but you
No.
have mentioned, you know, how do you find some of these insane deals on eBay?
Well, with regard to eBay and MacBooks, my search strategy is very unconventional, and that is I try to find like the absolute worst listing I can possibly find that I know nobody is gonna want to spend a lick on. And of course, people do. I mean, there are people that bid against me, obviously.
Yeah.
But usually those listings will go for ridiculously cheap. And it depends on the machine I'm looking for. But in the case of a Retina, as long as the screen's good, like nothing else matters because the screen's the most expensive thing that you can't fix. So, like, if a screen's bad, you have to replace the screen. But as long as the screen's good, the whole other machine, the rest of the machine could be a complete pile of junk. But as long as the screen is good and functional, and I can at least sort of tell that that's the case from the listing, it's not always the easiest thing, I'll get it. And if the screen is good, and it's like a motherboard issue or something like that, it's literally as simple as just looking at some schematics, doing some debugging, and taking some parts and soldering them on from a donor board. And you have a fully working system. I mean, that's how I get all my Macs.
Yeah, I mean, I guess when you have the ability to Frankenstein Macs together, you don't have a care in the world if the thing doesn't work because you can just easily fix it.
Yeah, I mean, I've bought a machine that someone took a screwdriver to the motherboard and just, like, ripped a bunch of components off of. I fixed that one, and that's still my daily late 2013 MacBook Pro top spec model that I use this day.
And you said that thing was like, would you get that for like $100 or
$100
something?
in, like, 2016, 2017.
Which is absolutely insane.
Yeah.
Especially back then. And then I know another thing you also modded was you you took one of like the old cheese grater Mac Pros that had like was it trace on the board got like ripped off or something,
Yeah,
and you
so
managed to repair that.
I bought a really cheap dual CPU tray, which I think was like under $100, which normally they go for like $400. I bought one of those off eBay that someone had they removed like the North Bridge heatsink, which has like a little thermal sensor attached to it, which plugs into a connector on the board. Well, they had ripped this connector off the board, and it also ripped off I had two traces, and it ripped both of the traces from the board, so you couldn't just solder the connector back on. You'd have to, run some bodge wires to fix it. So I bought that, fixed it in a matter of like an hour, just by running some bodge wires and soldering that connector to a different spot on the board after I like scraped off some solder mask. So I just soldered it to like a ground plane and then just ran the wires, with some copper wire. And after I did that, put it all back together, it works perfectly. Still use that to this day as well.
That's great. I mean, I know my Mac Pro that I use, I didn't have to worry about any of that stuff, and I felt like a mad scientist, when I flashed the firmware on the board to make it a 5,1 from a 4,1 because they're basically the same thing.
Yep.
And then here you are, soldering the board and actually doing work that I think the average person would never even dream of doing.
Yeah.
So so as far as like what would you say your favorite Mac of all time is?
That's a hard call. There's a few different ones that kind of are up there. I'd say the non-Retina 2012 model, the 15-inch one, and I guess technically the 17-inch one now that I've created it, are the best machines because they're upgradable, they're decently light and look good and still perform extremely well with today's tasks. And I think the second one is probably the late 2013 like Haswell-based Retina MacBook Pros because they have Haswell, they have Intel Iris Pro, they have Intel or NVIDIA GeForce GT 750M, and they are the last machine to run the last nice-looking version of OS 10, OS 10.9 Mavericks, which I still use to this day.
Which, I mean, it's like the same thing with iPhones, right? The best iPhone ever made was the iPhone 5 because it runs iOS 6, which is the best version of iOS ever created.
Exactly.
And all versions now are just hot garbage.
Yep, exactly.
Have you played around with any of the newer versions of iOS at all?
I mean, yeah, of course, I've used them on my phones. Like, my iPhone 6 I had on iOS 9, of course, never upgraded that. And now I use an iPhone 10 on iOS 14, which of course I will never upgrade because it's jailbroken. But other than that, I really don't daily use or really use at all any modern iOS versions, just because I don't have any need to.
Yeah, I think I know we talked about Luke Miani's channel earlier. He had a video out a couple weeks ago maybe about the bugs in iOS 16.
Yeah.
And that one of them specifically that stuck out to me was the AirPods one.
Yeah.
Which
yeah.
The funny thing is, I actually had that happen to me like a couple days ago. and that actually also happened to me like a few months ago, and I actually took a screenshot of it because I thought it was funny.
Yeah.
And then I've also had the same issue that he mentioned where the phone was working, but like the screen just wouldn't turn on.
Yeah.
And I don't know why, but I had the same problem as he did. Like I would put like my AirPods in and go to play some music or something on my phone, and screen just wouldn't work, so I had to like hard reset the phone.
Nice. Yeah. No, Apple software quality has just gone on a straight decline ever since iOS 7 was released. So, especially iOS, but well, I guess kind of macOS now as well, but iOS, it's just never been as well polished, and I'm not just talking the UI, but just the software functionality in general has never been quite as well polished and nicely working as iOS 6 and older.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of iOS 6 was definitely a nice looking UI and well functioning. I think it got some backlash back in the day for the whole Maps debacle,
which is unfortunate because Apple Maps is a very small part of, the operating system, and to discount the entire thing just based on one bad app, which granted probably didn't have enough development time. I mean, compared to things these days, it's like that's a non-issue. But
Right.
back then when people actually expected stuff to work, Apple Maps not working very well was a big issue. Yeah. So yeah, that's very unfortunate, and otherwise is a bad spot on the otherwise perfect iOS 6.
But I mean, even still, though, it would have gotten better over time as iOS 6 updates came out.
Yeah,
So, I
yeah.
mean, if you're running a later version of it, I mean, you probably wouldn't have too much of an issue. Also, this is something, I guess, on the topic of iPhones. Did you see this week MKBHD bought
Yes.
spent 40 grand on a sealed iPhone?
Yes, I did. I did indeed.
So, on the topic of first gen iPhones, you have a fancy dancy tool tutorial on your YouTube channel about how to downgrade one of those.
Yes.
So how did you figure out that process? Because I know
I
I
mean,
followed that tutorial.
that's
And
not a process that I figured out. That's something that I had seen somewhere that seemed to work fairly well. And the biggest issue with downgrading to iOS 1 or iPhone OS 1.0 is activating it once you've already done the downgrade. And that's what that method really works well on. And I've even downgraded some iPhones, some original iPhones that didn't even have iOS 1.0 when they were new to iOS 1.0, and I was able to make it work with that method. So I think that's a pretty good method. Not something I came up with, obviously, but something that I saw and thought was the best way to do it. So I made a video about it. That way, if people wanted to see exactly how it was done, they could just follow that.
because I know in MKBHD's video they had problems activating their phone, which
Yeah.
I'm assuming using your method, even though it was already on. I'm assuming it was on 1.0
Yeah, I mean, it would be on 1.2
something.
maybe at the most. But yeah, if you were to follow just the part where I show like how to like jailbreak it, I mean, yes, you kind of have to jailbreak it in a way. You don't really have to install any like jailbreak tools or anything, but you do have to exploit the device in some way, shape, or form to make that work. But if you had done that part just to achieve the activation, you would, it would have worked.
Yeah, I mean some people don't like the idea of jailbreaking per se, but I mean I've followed the method, and like if you look at the bone stock iOS 1.0, I mean there's no inclination at all that the phone's jailbroken.
Yeah, exactly. If you just run that exploit to activate it and don't install anything else, I don't know if anything even persists after that, but eventually, I mean, yes, you're technically jailbreaking it, but it's not really going to be obvious.
So it sounds to me like MKBHD and his team should have reached out to you about that video so they could have activated their phone.
Or just, watch the video, but
That's true. But I mean, I think getting to collab with him probably would have been pretty cool.
yeah.
So, do you have any other? So you collabed with Luke Miani. You've also collabed with Louis Rossman too,
Yes.
which I think that was pretty impressive. I know he was all over that that 2011 mod you did with the GPU.
Yeah. So his shop personally doesn't really work on those that old anymore. But it was something that he was interested in if he was still gonna work on those machines.
Yeah, I mean I think probably he's very very outspoken for sure about Mac repairability and that kind of thing. And obviously you're really into the Mac repairability stuff too. So as far as like repairability of Apple machines now, what's kind of your take on the newer machines and kind of how they're known for not really being as repairable as some of the older ones that you're more accustomed to working on?
Yeah, and at the same, I'm kind of like partial on that because like yeah, it sucks, but like I see why they had to do it in
Yeah.
some cases. Like you can't really achieve like such a thin machine if you have like a big old 2.5-inch drive in there. Like SODIMM slots take up a lot of room too. You don't really think about it, but they do.
Yeah, that's a
So
good
like
point.
soldered on RAM is necessary, and with Apple Silicon, like the RAM is literally soldered straight to the chipset.
Right.
So like for bandwidth reasons, like going through a connector would actually harm your ability to maintain signal integrity at such high speeds. So yeah, I see why they do it, and yeah, it sucks to not be able to upgrade it, but I think like upgrading might just require a little bit of soldering, like like that's just what you have to accept. But it is still possible. It is still possible.
So so do you think so you mentioned and that Apple Silicon chips, the RAM soldered to the chip. Do you think it's possible to desolder the RAM chips and put new RAM chips on there and
It
essentially upgrade the RAM
it
that
is
way?
impossible. It is possible, yes. And the reason I know that is because well, someone has done it before.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And it was like some company in China or something that, does this type of stuff all the time. Um, the issue though with that upgrade is getting the chips is impossible. Like I haven't found like a good source to get them other than from another M1 chipset.
Yeah,
So
I guess that's a good point.
that's a big issue. If you could get the chips, then it would be worth doing the upgrade. But if you have to take the chips off another board, it's not really worth it. Um, and then the storage, like I mentioned earlier, is not that difficult at all. And I believe you can actually get those chips that, just buy them either secondhand or even new if you're lucky. But you don't have to pull them from other boards.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably a little beyond the scope of. I mean, because some people out there like the idea of opening their computer and just putting a new RAM stick in there might seem like a daunting task. So,
Yeah, that's
talking
true.
about soldering a new chip to the board, because when you talk about like soldering chips too, it's not like you take your soldering iron and some little wire and kind of like solder a
No.
connector. Like you're like full on like you need what I guess for the people that aren't familiar, what's some of like the tools that you would need to perform some kind of job like that?
Well, most of these chips you're going to be working with are BGA, so you'll need like all the BGA equipment, like hot air station, board preheater, BGA nozzle for your hot air if you're doing like big BGAs, um, stuff like that. And then if you want to take chips off other boards and get them ready to put on a different board, you have to have the necessary stencil to reball the chip. You either have to use solder paste or physical solder balls, depending on your stencil and how big your chip is, and stuff like that. So there's a lot. It's very involved. But if you have all the stuff and you have a little bit of experience with it, it's really not that difficult per se.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's kind of like if you have any, it's kind of just like following the steps of you take it off and then you put the things back where they're supposed to go. It's just I guess kind of a little bit of a daunting task, especially if you're dealing, say you're trying to, like we mentioned, solder on new RAM on an M1 or M2 series chip. You know how expensive those things are,
I know.
potentially risking
You don't want to
destroying it.
destroy it. I know.
So I guess in the one sense that would be a good thing about some of the older unibody machines with how cheaply that you can get your hands on those. And with how many that are out there that don't work, you can have plenty of donor boards. And
Exactly. And you don't really have to worry about irreversibly like repairing or damaging it, because you can always get another one for not that much. They're not like thousands of dollars. You're in maybe $100
yeah,
at most for like another board or something. So
yeah, especially with the whole depreciation thing that's been going on with the Apple Silicon Macs coming out.
yeah,
Intel is kind of just absolutely tanked.
yes, I know.
Which I I was looking on eBay a while ago at M1 Mac Minis specifically, and I was kind of surprised what some people were trying to sell those things for.
Yeah,
Like in a decent amount of cases, I saw people trying to sell them for more than you could get on like Apple refurbished.
yeah, yeah.
So I'm not exactly sure what's going on there. But yeah, Intel Macs in general have absolutely tanked in
I know.
price.
I know.
Which, if you're looking for an older like Retina MacBook, I mean, yeah, they're not supported anymore, but OpenCore is pretty darn good at
Yep.
getting them up to. Um,
Ventura. I mean, even
yeah,
like I would go to Ventura on anything that has metal. So any 2012 and later should be good on Ventura.
yeah. I mean, I'm on my MacBook here that we're recording this on. It's running Ventura with OpenCore, and I really haven't had any issues at all.
Yeah.
I think the only issue I did have with it, which was kind of weird, was I installed the root pat or the patches for it,
Yeah.
and then for whatever reason, like Wi-Fi support just stopped working. for some reason, and I'm trying to remember exactly. I think Wi-Fi wasn't really working, and I was trying to like uninstall the root patches, but it was like you need internet to do this.
Yeah.
And I was like, well, I don't have internet because my Wi-Fi is not working, which was why I was trying to uninstall them. But aside from that, like minor hiccup, yeah, I mean, I haven't had any issues with it at all.
Yeah, no, it works generally very well, based on what I've seen.
Yeah. So, as far as like some of the older Mac support, I know I've had some issues on my Mac Pro trying to upgrade to Ventura, specifically with the like Bluetooth and all that fun stuff. So I thought I heard online somewhere that potentially that issue could be the fact that I have a PCI card in with USB 3 in it. Have you heard anything about that with
I haven't
OpenCore?
really heard about that, but the stock Bluetooth and Wi-Fi module should just work with OpenCore, no issue.
Okay.
So,
Yeah, because I think I did hear somewhere that I think it was I forget which video it was, but they were mentioning like if you had something with the like a PCI card with USB 3 on it would like mess with the patcher or something to potentially I don't remember what it was. That I might try to re-upgrade that again. But I mean my Xserve, it's running Ventura no problem,
Good.
which is just fantastic.
yeah.
And you have an Xserve too, right?
It's not one that can run OpenCore, though. It's a 1,1, but it's just running as a web server and running Arch Linux at this point, so.
Yeah, I mean, I would run my Xserve a lot more. The only problem is how loud that thing is.
Yeah,
and
I
another thing that I did on mine was I was enabled the lights out management port. I
Yeah.
figured how to get that working.
Good.
And I was monitoring like the power draw on that thing, and it was pulling like 140 watts.
Yep.
Literally just doing nothing.
Yeah, that's what they do.
Which,
Yes.
I mean, it's kind of funny because, it's just sitting here on the macOS desktop drawing 140 watts, and then you have like, the newer Apple Silicon machines that can't even draw 140 watts even if they try to, and are like full maxed out, which
Yep.
kind of funny. So what is the Xserve I find kind of interesting as back when this really isn't much of an issue anymore since Apple Silicon and the price of Mac Pros have tanked, but back when 2012 Mac Pros were like insanely expensive, people were talking just get like an old Xserve because it's basically a Mac Pro just
it's not as convenient.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, all you need is, like a dedicated server closet and
Yeah, and just, as long as it's not in the same room that you're working in, it's probably fine.
Yeah.
Not to mention you don't have any, like, native audio. You have to use, like, a USB sound card or something.
Yeah. I mean, not to mention the same room, I mean, same house.
Yeah.
Because one thing that I noticed with mine was I could have it, like, specifically, I guess, when it's booting up, when it's on the desktop and the fans have not calmed down because they're still loud, but, gone to their idle state, I guess you could say. When it's first booting up, like, I could be, on a basically on the opposite end of my house with, like, all the doors closed and everything, and I can still hear that thing.
Yeah.
So, well, dosdude1, this has been a pleasure. I enjoy hanging out with you. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Yeah.
Hope you guys enjoyed this conversation. We'll definitely have to have you back again sometime for sure.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on.
Yeah, of course.
So there you go. That was my conversation with dosdude1. Of course, we talked a lot more than that, but of course it was off the podcast air, I guess you could say. I mean, just two bros just hanging out, having a good time. So it was a blast getting to hang out with dosdude1. I hope you enjoyed that conversation as much as I enjoyed having it. And if you enjoyed this episode, I ask that you leave it a rating and review and subscribe to the Dark Assassins podcast if you haven't done so already. Also, be sure to share this episode around with all of your friends and family members to hear all the amazing work that dosdude1 has done. And also be sure to check him out in the links below. I have links to his GitHub and to his YouTube channel down below where you can check out some of the outstanding work that he's done. And if you have any questions about this episode, or you have any comments about the episode, or questions for future episodes, drop me an email at contact@darkassassinsinc.com, or you can click the link in the show notes down below for that. And that's going to do it for me in this episode of the Dark Assassins podcast. We will be back with a normal episode next week. But until next time, my fellow assassins, remember, bool nothing equals true. If action not equal to null, return true. I'll see you next time on the Dark Assassins podcast.